Welcome to OSM Operation Safe Mode. Peace be with you. This morning we share with you the second episode of the 5-part series on Peter's Way of the Cross. Last week we did a little introduction of the 14 stations. I pulled those stations apart to show you how we can use them as meditations, how the first and second station begins our exhilarating journey into truth and even accepting the difficulty of the cross. Sometimes that cross is a bit heavier when we're not ready to accept it as a true suffering. But once we come to realize there's only one truth, there's only one kingdom, we begin to embrace it. For Peter, his exhilaration came in his ability to profess what Pilate did not know. And because Pilate did not know, he let him go to his death. He washed his hands from him. How true that is. When we don't know truth, we wash our hands from God's call to follow him. But Peter bravely, through the Holy Spirit, by the will of the Father, proclaims that truth. And then he receives his cross in the form of the keys of the kingdom. We will see as time goes on, the burden of this cross will become apparent in Peter's inability to respond with the Spirit, but more so with his brokenness. Peter continues that journey as we start our second episode tonight. What I would like to do is to share the 3 falls of Peter. So we will be skipping over the 3 help stations, stations 4, 5, and 6, and we'll also skip station number 8, the women of Jerusalem, in order that we can look at these 3 falls together and what they mean for us, what they meant for Peter, and certainly what they meant to Jesus on his way. So let us take a short break, a word from our sponsor, and then we will begin with our second meditation.
One hour later.
Yes.
Father, I'm the last one. This may take a while.
Thank you, dear. Welcome back. When we look at the 3 falls of Jesus on the way, we must see them as they are in context to the stations of the cross, but also see them as a progression of the submitting of his will to the upcoming will of the Father, and that is his crucifixion. The first fall is a sign of reality. It's when that reality crushes in on us, that we have this desire, but all the emotional experience of desiring to do it gives way to the weariness of what is to follow. It is here that under the weight of the first fall, Jesus is pressed to the ground for the first time, having to trust in his Father's love to help him to continue on. Of course, as Jesus gets up, he will receive help in 3 different ways. His second fall, though, shows that even though we receive help from family, friends, and strangers, we still need to take one step, each step, under our own power, under our own will, submitting to the fall and the call of Christ himself. So the second fall always reminds us that when Jesus gets up, it is the fall of perseverance, that he will continue to move forward and keep his focus on what is to come. The third fall represents the full submission of Jesus to the upcoming crucifixion. Because once Jesus falls in the ninth station for the third time, he knows if he stands again, there will be no more walking for him. Everything will be done at him and to him, submitting himself to that gift of our salvation. So let us look at the three falls that Peter experiences as he tries to journey with Christ under the weight of this call to be the rock, the weight of the keys. The first fall is perfect in relationship to the reality crashing in all around him. It's in actually the same verse of what Jesus tells Peter. Look, you're going to be the rock, and on you I'm going to build my church. And what you hold bound is bound, and what you hold loose is loose. And in the next verse in the scriptures, Jesus reveals to him for the very first time that the Son of Man will be taken. He will be put to death, and then on the third day he'll rise again. Peter's first fall comes when he approaches Jesus as the rock, as the head apostle. And he says, I will not permit this to happen. I will not allow them to take you to your death. And Jesus gives Peter a new name that allows him to crush to the ground under the weight of his new call as Peter, the leader of the church. Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. He went from the exhilaration of expressing the truth being revealed to him by the Father to acting so much like a man with that power that had been given to him that he is more a temptation to Jesus than the rock for which he desires to build his church. Jesus says, Peter, you're thinking as man thinks, not as God. So imagine under the first fall of the cross, Peter realizing in order for him to fulfill the will of the Father, he must put aside his own needs, his own human fears, and allow what is to happen to unfold in front of him. Peter has no idea what is about to come. How will he continue to win favor from Jesus when now he is seen as a temptation? Now he is seen as a hurdle, a pitfall for the Lord. The second fall for Peter is one of perseverance, and it comes in the form of trust and a lack of ability to remain focused on the one true God, to be focused on the mission, to be focused on Christ's call to follow. And this takes place when Peter walks on water. You remember the story well. They're in a boat, and Jesus had gone without them to pray. He begins to walk on the water towards them. In the midst of the storm, they see him. And immediately they become afraid. They think they see a ghost. But once they realize Jesus is the one walking on water, Peter wants to reinvigorate his intention to be that leader, to trust in whatever Jesus is asking him to do, even when he does not understand. And so he says to Jesus, if it is you, Lord, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come, Peter. And it is here that Peter desires to persevere in the trust that this is truly the Son of the living God. Peter steps out of the boat and begins to walk towards Jesus, focused on him. not thinking of his humanity, not thinking of the fear or his own words that condemns him as Satan instead of the rock. But Peter, once again, even though he's journeying towards submitting his will to Jesus by doing something no man has ever done, walk on water, once again he becomes aware of his humanness, the wind and the waves. And as he looks away from Jesus and becomes aware of the things that he cannot control, he begins to sink. And this is the second fall. The sinking into the water under the weight of the leadership that he has yet not figured out, that it will not be under his power, but it was when he becomes powerless that he can do the things that is called to be the rock of the church. Of course, Jesus reaches out to lift him up, and it is in here that Peter realizes that he's going to need to persevere through the many other times that he will not understand, that he will be thinking as man thinks, and that he will recognize that these times that he is not Satan, but Satan desires him to become the pitfall of Jesus. So Peter's beginning to understand through these falls that his will is standing in the way. As soon as he learns to leave go, he will be able to do great things. The third fall, which comes in the ninth station prior to the complete submission of will of Jesus as well as Peter in this case, is the story in the garden. Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asks his disciples, "Come and pray with me." Now, prior to them going out to the garden, we have the beautiful, in St. John's Gospel, the beautiful dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. He wants to wash their feet. And Peter says, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus says, "Unless I wash your feet, then you cannot become my servant. You cannot become my apostle." And immediately, Peter realizes, I need to submit to this. And he says, "Well, not just my feet, but wash my head and hands as well." And Jesus says, "Peter, if your feet are clean, if you've already washed, a man only needs to clean his feet." But then Peter goes on to make that great proclamation, does he not? When Jesus announces that they will take him and he will suffer and die. And this time he's thinking, okay, I'm going to get it right. I'm not going to try to stop him. And what does Peter say? "Then I will die with you." And Jesus says, "No, you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter says, "I will not." The third fall is the sleeping in the Garden of Gethsemane. Why do I consider that Peter's third fall? Because the third fall is the hardest to come back to the reality of the message of the cross. Falling asleep is not because they ate too much at the supper. Falling asleep is Satan's power over submitting oneself's will, not only to what Jesus must do, but to be the ones who will continue to believe in him through that suffering, through his death, into the resurrection. If you thought Jesus was disappointed, and Peter, when he tried to stop him and rebuked him and called him Satan, if you thought Jesus was kind of upset with Peter's inability to remain focused as he began to drown on the Sea of Galilee, it is here that Jesus is saddened the most by Peter, because his sleepiness, his unwillingness to stay awake in prayer, meaning keeping vigil with the coming of the kingdom, how could this man become the one who would lead the church into that kingdom here until that kingdom is known fully in heaven? This fall for Peter, his sleep would be rudely awakened, and he will stand again to defend Jesus as he promised, as he cuts off the ear of the chief priest's guard. But again, he acts with his love caught up in his human nature. But now he will awake to a ruder reality, as his will be taken from him, and he too will find his way to his own crucifixion. When we think of the falls along the way, as I've described them for Peter, we need to look at our own lives and say, what are those falls for me? When was it that I was so gung-ho, full of the Spirit, to follow Jesus wherever he will take us, and fall so quickly? Because the world, because our own pride, because of our own inability to be deep in relationship with Christ, put us down in the dirt. When is it the time that we find ourselves trying to respond, but failing, doing what we think that is right, in essence, in our faith, walking on water, only to find ourselves begin to drown, when the fears of the world around us seem to be so much more stronger than our faith and our hope? And when is it that we fall and fail, and we fall asleep, if you will, as Peter did? Fall asleep to Jesus' love. Fall asleep to his friendship. Fall asleep because being his friend and being in love with him only means one thing: submitting our will fully to his, so that we may proclaim the good news. Next week, we will look at the 3 help stations. Who will be the help that Peter receives in and through these falls? And as I describe the help stations to you from the perspective of what we hear and see in the scriptures, realize that as Peter receives that kind of help, he becomes that help to all of us after the resurrection, and especially after Pentecost, when he is once again filled with the Holy Spirit to hear perfectly, as the rock of the church needs to, the truth and love of Christ, the Son of the ever-living God, the King of all kings, the one who came into the world to die so that we may live forever. So continue on your Lenten journey. Continue to meditate upon these stations, so that as the saints did, we know we're forged into holiness as we submit our will to the Father. That the falls on the way are not failures. They're just a reminder of what we cannot accomplish without the grace of God. So continue to stay safe in the Lord. Be forged through the life for which you live to become his saint.